Okay, so welcome back to the next lecture. This is going to be part one of neuroanatomy. And I broke it up into two sections just because the second part is a little bit longer. This first one is going to be kind of a shorter lecture. Um, but I felt like if I put it with the second lecture, it was too long. So this is going to be neuroanatomy part one. And we're not going to necessarily need you to memorize a bunch of different brain areas necessarily. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of different brain regions, so we're going to try to keep it to the things that you probably will hear most frequently as a psychology student and that are, tend to come up within neuroscience topics. This first section is going to go over more of some like vocabulary and vernacular terms that are necessary to understand when you have a neurophysiology or neuroanatomy course later on, when you have like a whole course dedicated to it. So hopefully some of this vocabulary won't be super unheard of when you come against it in future courses. So we'll start here. All vertebrate nervous systems are bilaterally symmetrical, and each side of the brain is referred to as a hemisphere. So unless otherwise stated, what that means is that if you have your hypothalamus here, or your cerebral cortex, or basal ganglia, or thalamus, whatever, you have two hemispheres of your brain. So your brain is split down the center, and it's connected by a corpus callosum, and each hemisphere has like identical nuclei or brain regions on either side. So it's like you have a amygdala on the right hemisphere and an amygdala on the left hemisphere. You have a cerebral cortex that's split down the center, and you have two hemispheres, and both of those brain regions are essentially identical on each side of the hemisphere. So that's what bilaterally symmetrical means. And this picture in particular is showing some typical gross anatomical structures. And when somebody says gross in anatomy, that just means the like undefined large section of tissue. So here we have cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, thalamus, hippocampus, cerebellum, the brainstem, amygdala, and hypothalamus. And I said thalamus, but there's also the hypothalamus, which I think we must have already at least alluded to in some other lecture. But if not, then by the time we get to homeostasis and stuff like that, we'll be talking about the hypothalamus all the time. But I say gross anatomical structure because we can see here that the brainstem, for instance, is broken up into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And the midbrain will be further broken up into even more subdivisions. So when we're talking about like just gross anatomical structures, we're saying, well, we're referring to the cerebral cortex, but the cerebral cortex is composed of many different subnuclei. So don't let the kind of anatomical pictures like this make you think that the brain just has these few subregions. It's actually composed of many dozens of subregions, and there's new ones every day because in behavioral neuroscience or in studies that are looking at the function of the brain, they will frequently discover new subnuclei that it's not like we didn't see them there before. We knew that they were there, but as each nucleus, and I'm going to define nucleus in a moment, but each brain area is tested, and if we find that it has a different activity or some kind of different function, then it's basically subdivided. So like the amygdala is one that's really important. The amygdala is not just the amygdala. There's the basolateral amygdala, the central nucleus of the amygdala, and sometimes it even gets I'm not someone that studies the amygdala, but so I can't remember like most of the different substructures within the amygdala, but you even get like different subregions within the basolateral amygdala or the central nucleus of the amygdala, lateral version or whatever. It's like never ending. The cerebral cortex is another one where you have the medial prefrontal cortex, You have the ventral medial, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. The medial prefrontal cortex is subdivided into the prelimbic and infralimbic regions, for instance. So there's a lot of subdivisions that kind of arise from each of these more umbrella anatomical locations. So, kind of as I was alluding to, when you're referring to these structures with great specificity, neurobiologists will use technical terms derived from directionality and location of each anatomical structure in relation to some other structure. So when they are saying the medial prefrontal cortex, for instance, they're talking about the cortex, and they're talking specifically about the prefrontal cortex, and they're talking specifically about the area of the prefrontal cortex that is medial, right? So, and it's in relation to something else. So, they're saying, well, if we have the cortex, which is going to be this bilateral, two hemispherical structure. And if, I'm making this shape, you have probably never seen a slice of a prefrontal cortex, but it has roughly a shape like this, right? So we have, if my hands are the edge of the brain, as you go towards the center, that's going to be called the midline. So we can kind of see that here with this rat that is split down the center of this coronal section. So here, this line that's going vertically is referring to the midline of the animal. And similarly, each brain structure is going to have a midline or all these different planes of direction to them. So if we have the brain and you were to look directly on the brain, which I'm not showing you right now, unfortunately, I have a picture of a sagittal section of the brain. This is the sagittal section, so I can go ahead and point that out right here. But if you're looking at a coronal section, which if we look again at this rat and we see that this, if you look at my laser pointer and you can see what I'm outlining here, that is essentially going to be what's called a coronal section, okay? But if we look at this big blue square right here, that's going to be what's called a sagittal section. So I remember that because sagittal starts with an S, and you're looking at basically the side of the tissue. And I always remember coronal because you put a crown on your head like this, right? So coronal starts with C, and you're putting the crown on your head like so. And so if you were to look at a coronal section, it'd be like if you were to take some kind of blade and cut my head straight down this way. Anyways, what I was saying was that if we did have a coronal section of the medial prefrontal cortex, and we wanted you to look at the medial aspect, we would draw a dotted line that's going down the center of that portion of brain, and then we would point to the middle of this circle, if you can imagine that. And that would be the midline. So again, on this rat, the midline is here. If we were to cut this rat with this coronal rectangle, this little blue coronal rectangle, and we said, where's the midline, you would point to this dotted line right here. So that's the midline. So things are, when you're saying lateral or medial, when you're using that verbiage, you're referring to in relation to the midline. Okay, so if something is medial, that means it's towards the midline, right? So if something is lateral, that means it's away from the midline. So that's what these little arrows are pointing towards here. It's like we have the midline, which is going straight up and down in this vertical dotted line. Lateral is away from that dotted line. Medial is towards that dotted line. So the reason why I said all that, if you can remember why I started this rant, it was because I was saying that there are certain nuclei or areas of the brain that are named based on their location in relation to some other structure or towards them, or in relation to the midline. So the medial prefrontal cortex is named such because it's towards the midline of the cortex, right? And it's towards the middle of that portion of the cortex. So it's called the medial prefrontal cortex. You can also have something like the dorsolateral amygdala, right, which would be dorsal and towards the side. Okay, so or the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. In that scenario, we're talking about the bottom of the medial prefrontal cortex. So I've already said lateral is away from the midline, and I've already said that medial is towards the midline. And now I just used another word that I haven't yet described, which was ventral. Ventral, we have to go towards this little neural axis down here on the left. But ventral is saying towards the bottom, roughly. When you're saying bottom, top, that's not super descriptive, which is why we have the terms dorsal, ventral, or rostral, caudal. But basically here, what we're looking at is dorsal is towards the top. And this can get a little bit confusing because where these words came from was studying the physiology of four-legged animals. And since four-legged animals like this rat, they're on all fours, and when they're looking, their head is going up like this, right? So as a human, right, dorsal is towards the top of my head, but as you're going down the head and towards the back, then dorsal is on the back. And that's because, that the only reason why that's confusing is because since we're bipedal animals, meaning that we walk on two legs instead of all fours, it looks like dorsal is referring to both the top and the back, but it's really just referring towards essentially the top of the animal's back, right? So if we can, again, look at this neural axis, dorsal is going to refer to either the top of the head, right, so going up, or it's going to be referring to the back if you're referring to an animal that's on four legs. But this is also true, like the easiest way to remember dorsal is that the dorsal fin is on your back, right? Or if you're a gym person, your latissimus dorsi, which is the lats, the big muscles that are doing your pull-ups for you, are on your back, and that's dorsal. Ventral, however, is going to be towards the bottom or towards the belly button, essentially. So we also have rostral, which is going to be towards the front, and caudal, which is going to be towards the back. So I always remember rostral because rostral sounds like nostril, and rostral is going to be towards the front of the head. So I'm going to stop talking in terms of like whole body because I feel like as I'm listening to myself, it's sounding super confusing. So I'm just going to now talk about in relation to the brain, but I'm kind of trying to give you this rat diagram also because these directional phrases are from physiology and anatomy studying, so that's where they're derived originally. But just looking at the brain, if we're saying dorsal, we're talking about towards the top. Okay, so if we said the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, that would be referring to the dorsal aspect of the medial prefrontal cortex, which means the very top part of the medial prefrontal cortex. If we're talking ventral in reference to just the brain, that is talking about below something. Okay, so if we're talking about the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, we're saying the bottom aspect of the medial prefrontal cortex. If we're talking about something being more rostral to something else, we're saying it's towards the front of the brain. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is rostral to the basal ganglia, for instance. The cerebellum is caudal, which means caudal means tail, so it's towards the back of the brain in reference to the hippocampus, for instance. Let's also just take from this picture here, if we were to say the dorsal basal ganglia, we would be talking about this portion right here that I'm highlighting with my laser pointer. If we were talking about the ventral aspect of that, we would be talking about this bottom portion here. If we were talking about rostral, we would say this portion here. If we were saying caudal, we would say this portion here. And also just to make things even more painful, there are other names for rostral and caudal. Rostral and caudal are actually more old school. The ones that are used more typically today are anterior and posterior. So again, anterior and rostral, they mean the same thing. It means towards the front, and you can remember that because rostral rhymes with nostril. And then posterior and caudal are the same, and you can remember that because caudal is Latin for tail, something like that. But basically, I'm going to put that into your brain right now, that caudal is tail, whatever it really means, and that means towards the back, right? So caudal or posterior means back. Now, this directionality, as far as the brain is concerned, is also derived from the curvature of the embryonic neural tube when we are developing. So it's a nightmare, and I'm going to keep saying this especially when we get to the second section of neuroanatomy. But there are a lot of different names for different subregions of the brain. So one that drives me insane is forebrain and hindbrain. And that's just because the forebrain is really kind of just referring to everything that is not the, basically the midbrain and back. Even the midbrain is sometimes referred to as forebrain, right? So that's why I get so frustrated, is because depending on how you were trained, there will be different names for each kind of gross anatomical directionality of the brain. So forebrain is literally like the whole cortex and the thalamus and the hippocampus and the amygdala and everything. And then if you look at this little structure right here, once you get to the pons, medulla, cerebellum, that's all like hindbrain stuff. But it can get really confusing, and even in the primary literature, sometimes people will refer to certain brain areas as one thing, and other researchers will refer to that same brain area as something totally different. So it can be confusing if you have a journal club and you think you're talking about the prelimbic cortex, but really you're talking about the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, for instance. That can get confusing. So in any case, let's go ahead and take a look here. So I think I hit everything on here that you need to know. You need to know what dorsal, ventral, rostral, caudal, and anterior and posterior mean. We have like a little summary right here on this next page, but on this first page, make sure that makes sense to you. You also need to know what a coronal section would be. Coronal is like you're placing that crown right on your head. That would be if you were to cut this rat directly from this blue rectangle. So you also need to know what sagittal is. So the sagittal plane would be a section just like this brain right here. If you were to cut this rat directly down the center and pull it apart, so if this were the rat and you were to cut it like this and then look at one of these sections right here, that would be sagittal. So take some time and familiarize yourself with those terms. Here again is just a brief summary of everything that I just described. So we have dorsal, which is toward the back, away from ventral, and ventral is towards the stomach or below. Ventral is toward the stomach, away from the back. And again, this table, it comes from a book where the way that they're talking about this is in relation to quadricep animals, so animals that are, walking on all fours. So that's why it's using language like towards the back, away from the stomach. And, that's important for you to know. It's not super true of when we're talking about the brain of a human because of the way that the human is looking. But if you were talking about a dog or a rat, then it would still make sense, because if this is the head and, the animal's on all fours, then dorsal on an animal's head that's walking on all fours is the same direction as the back of that animal, like a dorsal fin on a dolphin, for instance. Anterior or rostral is towards the front, rhymes with nostril. Posterior is caudal, toward the rear, Latin for tail. Superior is above another part. Yeah, so I didn't mention this, I don't think, but superior, again, as it says, is just something that's above some other anatomical structure that you care about. Inferior is in relation to being below some other structure that you care about. Lateral is toward the side, away from the midline. Medial is toward the midline, away from the side. Proximal is located close to the point of origin or attachment. So honestly, for proximal and distal, ipsilateral, contralateral, actually coronal, I want you to know, sagittal, I want you to know. But for proximal and distal, we're not going to be using those terms, I don't think, ever again in the course. But I mean, if you go on to do any kind of work in an electrophysiology lab or something, then this will be incredibly important to know, because sometimes people are, investigating the proximal dendrites, for instance, or the distal dendrites. But proximal means located close to the point of origin or attachment. Distal means located more distant from the point of origin or attachment. So if we had a dendrite, if my hand is a neuron and my fingers are the dendrites, right? If I said that I wanted to look at the distal dendrite, then I'm talking about this aspect of the dendrite, right? Like the tip of my finger. If I was talking about the proximal dendrite, I would be talking about this part of the dendrite that's towards the soma, or which is my hand here. Yeah, so ipsilateral is on the same side of the body, contralateral is on the opposite side of the body. And then coronal plane is if you were to make a section going directly down the side here and then were to pull my face off and you were to look directly at my face, that would be coronal. Sagittal would be, again, these are both sagittal views. So if you were to cut the brain directly in half like this and look at it from the side, that is sagittal. And horizontal would be a plane that shows the brain structure as seen from above. Okay, so let's go ahead and, I mean, this is just one of those things that you just have to spend some time with and get familiar with the terminology, unfortunately. So there are two major branches of the nervous system. There is the central nervous system, which is referring to the brain and the spinal cord. And there is the peripheral nervous system, which is essentially referring to everything that's not the brain and the spinal cord. So you will definitely need to know that. I will for sure ask questions about this on the exam. But the central nervous system, the CNS, is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is literally all nerves that are not in the central nervous system. And there's a lot of them. So that's why I have this like weird picture here. So it's important to understand the vocabulary. Bundles or grouping of nerves in the central nervous system are called nuclei or nucleus. Okay, so when I refer to the amygdala, that is a nucleus or a nuclei. It's a bundle of nerves that when they come together, they have some kind of gross anatomical function. So like the ganglia, the thalamus, the hippocampus, those are all nuclei because they are distinct groups of neurons in the brain, which is in the central nervous system. So let's see what I wrote here. Bundles of nerves within the central nervous system are called nuclei. Yep. The grouping of neurons are also referred to as gray matter. Yeah, so you'll hear things like gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is referring to the actual neurons themselves, whereas the somas, rather. The fibers are called white matter, and this is because the fiber consists of axons of projection neurons, and since they are myelinated, they have the white appearance. Yeah, so if you remember from the the cells lecture that we went over, and we were talking about the myelin sheath, that fatty substance that wraps the axons, that's why it's referred to as white matter, is because that fatty substance is white. So the grouping of neurons are also referred to as gray matter. That's neurons. What I'm referring to there is the actual somas, the cell bodies. And then the fibers are the white matter. The fibers are the axons that are leaving and myelinated, that are projecting to other tissues. In the version of the PowerPoint that you get to, I'm going to actually change this from a grouping of neurons to the grouping of neurons, like the cell bodies and the soma and stuff like that. And again, here we just have some different views. So this is a horizontal view of the brain, because you're looking at it directly from above there. And then again, this is just another sagittal view there. So bundles of nerves that are outside of the central nervous system. So when you have a grouping of neurons that are distinct, that are outside of either the brain or the spinal cord, are called ganglia. So nuclei or nucleus are bundles of nerves in the central nervous system, so the brain or the spinal cord, and ganglia are those that are outside of the brain or the spinal cord. So this can get a little bit confusing though, because within the spinal column, you'll have ganglia that are not necessarily a part of the spine because they are in the peripheral nervous system and they are projecting to central nerves that are in the spine. And so we'll get to that momentarily, and I'll try to make that a little bit more clear. But I won't ask you any edge case trick questions. I will, though, almost certainly ask you, ganglia is a grouping of neurons in the PNS or the CNS, and you'll have to figure out, okay, yeah, it's part of the PNS, whereas nuclei are groupings of neurons that are in the central nervous system. So let's see what else I have here. The dorsal root conveys sensory information to the spine, while the ventral root conveys motor commands to the muscle, right? So the dorsal root here is essentially saying that there are nerves, and we'll go over this in sensation and perception, and I've already kind of alluded to this in the action potential lecture as well as the synapse lecture, but you have nerves that are all like your sensory nerves are how you see, how you smell, how you feel, how you taste, how you hear. These nerves communicate with the dorsal root of the spinal cord, and they are transmitting this sensory information. So you'll need to know that the dorsal root conveys sensory information to the spine, while the ventral root conveys motor commands to the muscles. So these are also called the afferent and efferent pathways. Afferent pathways are going towards the spine, or towards the central nervous system, and bringing information towards the central nervous system. Efferent pathways are exiting the central nervous system. So that's how I always remember it: is A is arriving, and A is for afferent, and E is for exiting, and E is for efferent. So you'll need to know that as well, which is that the afferent pathways bring sensory information towards the central nervous system. So that's how your central nervous system is being informed about the outside world. And then you have efferent nerves, which are leaving the central nervous system, that are conveying muscle commands. So you touch the stove, it's super hot. That sensory information goes to the brain through the afferent nerves or the dorsal root. And then your brain sends a command to the muscles, okay, you need to lift your hand away from the stove, okay? And that's the efferent pathway that's leaving through the ventral root that's telling your hand to get the heck off of the stove because it's too hot. So the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are in clusters outside of the spinal cord, and therefore they are called the dorsal root ganglia, right? So a ganglion is a grouping of nerves singular, and a ganglia is a grouping of nerves plural. So the cell bodies of the motor neurons are inside of the spinal cord. All right, let's go ahead and see here. Yeah, so I'm not going to test you on this diagram. It's just here to illustrate the point, which is it may also be interesting for you to know that there are different divisions of the spine, and based on those divisions, the names are derived. You have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. So if someone said that their T3 and T4 were fused, that is referring to their thoracic section being fused there. So yeah, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing this. Yeah, so basically what I'm saying here is that I'm not going to test you on this, but it's just important to know that when, the different columns of the spine here. So we have this cervical section, we have the thoracic division, lumbar division here, and sacral down here. So, if somebody's getting a lumbar puncture, the reason why it's called a lumbar puncture is because they are going through the vertebrae here, and they are going to puncture this part of the spine to take cerebral spinal fluid or whatever it is that they're doing their lumbar for, to test things that are in the brain. So I'm certainly not going to be testing you, though, on knowing this whole tree of information here. But as you can see, it is quite complex. But you may want to just know the fact that they're named after these various things. So again, like if you're having your T3 and your T4 fused, that's essentially saying that these two discs here in your spine are being fused together. Let's see also what I wrote here. Each segment of the spine is innervated by sensory nerves from the periphery. The spine then sends the sensory information to the brain, remember, through the afferent pathway, which in turn sends motor information through the efferent pathway back to the spine and ultimately to the periphery. If your spine is broken and the nerves held within are cut, you will lose all the sensory information from that point and below, as well as the ability to send the motor information, right? So if we do take a little look here at this diagram, and we see here that there's hip motion right here through T11 through L2, and you were to break or sever the nerves that are in that section, then you're not going to be able to move anything from the hips down, basically. So when somebody has a broken spine, the reason why they become paralyzed in some area of their body is because the nerves in that section were destroyed or cut or severed in some way. So let's go ahead and talk about the peripheral nervous system, which again, everything that we just talked about right now so far is the central nervous system, except for the definitions that I gave, which are, the ganglia. But all the other nerves are the peripheral nervous system. So again, we have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, which is realistically what a lot of neuroscience focuses on. We're very central nervous system centric, but the peripheral nervous system is incredibly important, and like I said, makes up most of the nerves because it's all of the nerves that are not in the brain or the spine. So the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into several branches, including the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. And you will need to know essentially this little tree here. You need to know for sure that the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and then you definitely need to know for sure that the peripheral nervous system is everything that's not the brain and the spinal cord. Furthermore, you need to know that there is a somatic and autonomic nervous system, and those are within the peripheral nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is referring to all of the nerves that innervate the body that you have conscious control over, okay? So again, the somatic nervous system is referring to the nerves that innervate all of the muscles, all of the body parts that you have control over. So, the ability to do a crunch or to go for a run or to do a pull-up or to eat with a fork, all of those things are consciously controlled by you through the somatic peripheral nervous system. And then you also have the autonomic nervous system, which is comprised of three subsections: the enteric, which is referring to the stomach and the gut, and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Excuse me. So for this section, what you'll need to know is that the peripheral nervous system is divided into somatic, which is conscious control over the body, and autonomic, which, as the name suggests, is automatically controlled, not by you, but not consciously at all. It's controlled by various regulators like heart rate, breathing. I mean, you have control over breathing to some extent, but If you try to hold your breath long enough, you will start to breathe again, I assure you. So that is all controlled by the autonomic nervous system. You should know also that, honestly, I don't know if I'll have any questions about enteric at all, just because it's a huge, it used to just be a part of sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, but because the gut has become such a focal point of feeding behaviors and neuroscience in the last decade, it's now been subdivided further into having its own division. But we don't really go over it very much in this course, so I'm just going to be asking you questions about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. I also want to point out on this diagram that you can see the pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic neurons. So again, if it's pre-ganglionic, that means it's part of the central nervous system. So all of this red right here that's in the spine, these are all pre-ganglionic neurons, which means that they're part of the central nervous system. They then go out and they talk to post-ganglionic nerves, which again, ganglia are groupings of cells that are in the peripheral nervous system. So I know that it's like annoying to hear me continuously say the same thing over and over again, but I'm just really trying to drive it home here that nuclei are in the central nervous system and that ganglia are the nerves outside of the central nervous system. And we can see that demonstrated here because we have pre-ganglionic cells and post-ganglionic cells. And we can see that we have the sympathetic divisions here that are primarily here in the thoracic section of the spinal cord. And then we have parasympathetic nerves, which are primarily in the brainstem and the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So let's see here before I start talking too much, if I'm going to talk about this. Yeah, so essentially the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are constantly working together to regulate homeostasis or to get you to react or to act to certain things that are happening. So the main fact that you need to know about the sympathetic nervous system, having taken this biological psychology course, is that it is going to send excitatory signals to prepare you for activity. So the sympathetic nervous system is activated under times of stress or when you need to be active, okay? So examples of the sympathetic nervous system in action is dilating the pupils so you can see better, right? You need the pupils to be dilated so you can get as much light information as possible. Increasing heart rate to deliver more oxygen. If you remember from our brief discussion of the vasculature, that your blood is delivering oxygen to all of your various organ systems. And so if you're in a fight or flight response, in this case you're in the you need to run or get out of there, which is when the sympathetic nervous system is being activated, your heart rate increases so the blood flows faster so you get oxygen to all of your musculature and your organ system. It can relax the lungs for easier breathing. And so what that means is it's not actually that you're breathing slower, it's that your lungs become less rigid. And so that might seem counterintuitive. I don't think I'll ask a question necessarily like that seems a little bit tricky, but it makes sense because if your lungs are rigid and it's hard for you to have them expand, then you're going to be getting less oxygen, right? So that actually makes sense even though it might seem counterintuitive. It stimulates the release of glucose from the liver, which we'll talk about this in the feeding and the hunger section, but glucose is the main source of fuel for your body and quick energy. So it will stimulate the release of that energy system for you to use in a fight or flight response. It reduces digestive activity, again, because you need the energy going towards the musculature that's going to either get you through that fight or get you out of there. And the main neurotransmitter that's used here is norepinephrine or adrenaline. You may remember we just talked about this, that adrenaline and epinephrine are the same chemical. But here it's norepinephrine or noradrenaline. is being released when the sympathetic nervous system is being activated. So from this, you need to know that when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, that's when you're scared. It starts with S, so it makes me think of that. Or it's when you are either going to fight or you're going to get out of there. So that's the fight or flight system that I'm sure you have heard about many times. It's also going to activate something that you probably will hear quite a lot throughout your psychology career, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. So this obviously is referring to an area of the hypothalamus which releases corticotropin releasing hormone to the pituitary gland, which again is also in the central nervous system. The pituitary gland then releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, or called ACTH. ACTH then stimulates, as it kind of sounds from the name, the adrenal gland, specifically the cortex of the adrenal gland, which then will release cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And all of this is induced through actions of the sympathetic nervous system. There's also a lot of important negative feedback of the HPA axis, and you can have a lot of pathological outcomes if this negative feedback loop is not functioning properly, like autoimmune conditions and post-traumatic stress disorder, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease like hypertension, which is high blood pressure, and subsequent vascular damage. So my head is covering this, I see, but you don't need to know any of that information anyway down here. What we need to know is that the hypothalamus releases CRH, which stimulates the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which then communicates with the adrenal gland to release cortisol. Okay. So that's all part of the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight system. But there's also another division, as you might expect, is going to be the opposite of essentially everything that the sympathetic nervous system is doing. So parasympathetic nervous system is essentially going to be what's happening during the rest and digest phase. So I think that those terms are pretty commonly used, the fight or flight and rest or digest. And so just try to remember that the sympathetic nervous system, let me just go back so I'm not confusing anyone. The sympathetic nervous system is activated when you're scared, and when you're scared, you fight or you run, right? The parasympathetic nervous system is activated when you're at peace, right? And when you're at peace, you rest and you digest, you eat. And generally speaking, if you want to know what the parasympathetic nervous system is doing to any one particular organ system, you can just assume it's doing the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system was doing. So it relaxes the pupils instead of dilates them. It decreases heart rate instead of increasing heart rate. It increases digestion and increases gut motility instead of decreasing those things. And the main neurotransmitter used is acetylcholine. So you should know that the main neurotransmitter used in the parasympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine, and you should know that the main neurotransmitter used in the sympathetic nervous system is norepinephrine. I'm going to call it norepinephrine, but it is also called noradrenaline. And you need to definitely know that the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight system, while the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest portion of the sympathetic nervous system. So, we kind of, a lot of times whenever we're explaining the basic functionality of any kind of group of physiological organ systems or anatomy, we will say things like what I just got done saying, which is that the parasympathetic nervous system is doing X and the sympathetic nervous system is doing Y. But realistically, both the central nervous, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are always working to varying degrees to keep you at a homeostatic set point. So it's not like if you're chilling, your pupils are always just totally relaxed. You know what I mean? Or that your heart rate is always low. I mean, you're going to have release of norepinephrine or release of acetylcholine at all points of the day. It's just that when we're talking about the rest and digest or the fight or flight aspect of it, it's that it's going to be dominant. One of them is going to be dominant over the other one. So if there's a bomb threat or somebody's got a gun or something, you're going to have activation of the sympathetic nervous system primarily, but that doesn't mean that your parasympathetic nervous system is just completely not functioning anymore. It's always a push and pull with the nervous system. So I realize now that I said at the beginning that this was going to be a short lecture, and I meant that because it was only 13 slides, but it for some reason took forever to get through. So I appreciate you hanging out with me today on this. And again, if there's any questions or any part of it was confusing, then go ahead and reach out so we can set up some virtual or in-person office hours this summer. Otherwise, I will see you in part 2 of neuroanatomy.